All right. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you, band. So, last week we talked about Psalm 29, which gives us a picture of God as a mighty storm. Psalm 29 tells us that God is greater than our fears, that God is mightier than the forces of chaos in our world. Gives us a beautiful picture of God overcoming those things. Tonight, we're going to shift. We're going to look at the story of a young couple whose fears almost came true until Jesus stepped in and fixed things without their knowledge. And that is the story of Jesus turning water into wine, found in John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. So let me read that for us. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who'd drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So imagine being at a wedding with an open bar, but less than an hour into the party, you find out that the booze is all gone. Everybody is looking forward to having a good time and getting plastered, and suddenly the party is over. That's it. That's the situation that this unsuspecting Jewish couple that we know nothing about is in when our story begins. This couple has vastly underestimated the amount of wine they're going to need for their wedding. Back in those days, wedding celebrations could last up to a week. And so running out of wine before the party was over would have been a social faux pas. You're supposed to keep everybody happy and partying the whole week long. So a social faux pas and a bad omen for the beginning of their marriage. It would have been looked down upon, not a good thing to start out with not even enough money to keep everybody with wine the whole week. We have no idea who these people were, but they obviously had some connection to Jesus' family in some way, because Mary and Jesus are both there. And apparently, Jesus had secured invites for the 12 disciples too, or maybe they knew them as well. We don't know. In all likelihood, this is a distant relative or a friend of the family, because Mary seems to know some behind-the-scenes stuff. Mary's like helping out with the wedding in some way, or has figured out that the wine is gone. And Cana is only a few miles from Nazareth. It's about 3.5 miles or so. So it's very possible it's somebody that the family knew in some way, shape, or form. We have no idea if Jesus wanted to be there, if it was a wedding that he went to out of responsibility, if he was having a good time or not. We're just dropped into the middle of this wedding. We don't have any other notion of why they're there. But I think it's safe to assume that Jesus was probably celebrating along with everybody else, probably having fun. In Matthew 11, we're told that the Pharisees called Jesus a glutton and a drunkard, and even though he definitely was not those things, he got that reputation from his willingness to enjoy food and drink and to associate with people that the Pharisees would have considered sinners. So Jesus is probably enjoying himself at this wedding. We don't know what that means, but he was, I'm sure. So we have this picture of Jesus and his disciples enjoying themselves in the midst of a wedding feast, and who knows how many days in we're at, and the wine runs out. And Mary, who, as we already said, is probably helping out behind the scenes, she finds out that, oh gosh, we're about out of wine, and she comes to Jesus, and he says, "They have no more wine." That's it. She just says, "They have no more wine." we have no clue what Mary expected to happen next. John tells us at the end of the passage I read that this is the first sign of Jesus' glory, which means, as far as we know, nobody had ever seen Jesus perform a miracle before. So it's not fair to say that she necessarily expected him to turn water into wine or to perform a miracle. We don't know what she was expecting. Maybe she thought Jesus would just send the servants out to get more wine, and that's why she tells the servants to do whatever he says. Maybe send them to, a neighbor's place, or one of the disciples lived nearby or something. Like, just go gather up the wine, right? Go walking down the streets and knock on doors until you get us some more wine. We don't know. Maybe Mary did expect a miracle from Jesus. It's hard. We don't have any clue. Mary, whatever she expected, she simply brought her problem before Jesus and just left it there. She lays it out plainly and assumes that he's going to take over from there. Mary may not have known what Jesus was going to do, but she certainly knew that her best move was to go to Jesus with her problem. But Jesus says, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." There's a few things it's probably the most confusing sentence in this whole story, so we need to clear some things up. First, when Jesus calls Mary woman instead of Mary or mom, it's not like he's not being disrespectful. It's not derogatory. He's not being like, woman, get out of here. He's not saying that. He's not being disrespectful. He's addressing Mary in another way. The Greek for woman there does not denote any disrespect. However, as much as Jesus is not being disrespectful, he is still giving Mary a bit of a rebuke. And he's having a good time, right? And Mary now wants him to take care of a problem for him. I don't know if this has happened to anybody else. This one definitely connects with me a little bit. I think Mary's kind of pressuring Jesus to perform, right? To be the good son, to do something. And again, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but for me, a lot of times when I'm with my family at Christmas or a holiday, it's like, oh, Grant is the pastor. Why don't you pray for our dinner? Or, oh, Grant does music. Why don't you, get your guitar out and sing a song? And it's like, come on, Mom, that's like work. Can I not do that at home? Do I have to do that? And I feel like there's maybe a little bit of that dynamic going on here. Jesus is kind of saying to Mary, come on, Mom, can't I just have a good time with my friends? Do I have to do work? Do I have to do what I'm here to do? But that's the simple version. There's more going on than that, a lot more. Jesus says that his hour has not yet arrived. And when he talks about his hour, he's referring to his death on the cross. All throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus talks about his hour multiple times. It comes up as a theme. And every time, other than this one, it's always very clear that he's referring to his eventual death on the cross and resurrection. So we can assume he means the same thing here. So really what Jesus is saying is that he doesn't want to perform a miracle because it's not time for his glory to be revealed yet. That's going to come later on the cross. But Jesus performs plenty of miracles after this one, right? All through the gospel, he heals people. So what's going on? It's not a total reticence to do miracles. What's happening is Jesus is pointing towards his death and resurrection. And essentially, John is using this, because this is the first miracle, to tell us that every miracle that Jesus performs is a small sign of the big miracle, the big thing that's to come. Even something as minor, comparatively, as changing water into wine, becomes a signifier of that ultimate miracle that Jesus will eventually perform, which is the resurrection. Now, despite being, basically just told by Jesus, hey, I don't want to do it, Mary's totally unfazed and simply just tells the servants to do it. She doesn't respond to him, he doesn't respond to her, she doesn't respond to him. They seem to be almost having two different conversations here. Mary just tells the servants, yeah, just do whatever Jesus says. Do whatever he tells you. And again, no idea what Mary's expecting. But maybe after Jesus' answer, she might have an inkling that he's thinking something bigger than just telling the servants to go buy wine. Because Jesus isn't talking that way, right? He's talking about his hour to come and glory and all those kind of things. Now the servants are waiting, and Mary goes off, and Jesus tells them to grab, there's 6 large stone vases used for ritual purification. So there are these big empty jars that would have had water in them, and these servants would have poured them over people's maybe feet when they came in, poured them over their hands to wash. So they've already been used, right? These jars are sitting there empty. And Jesus has the servants take these jars and fill them up with water again and take them to the master of the banquet and give him some of the water. So somewhere in there, again, the story seems to skip over like the how, the when, but the water fills up, and somewhere in the filling of the water and taking it to the master, the water just becomes wine. It's transformed. And it's not just any wine, but it's really, really good wine. Because they'd apparently reached the phase of the party when like the $2 chuck should have been coming out. The really, just bring out the worst of it and let it, people are already drunk. They might as well just drink whatever you've got left. Shouldn't matter. So the master is surprised that the groom has left this really great wine until the end. And so he goes and he pulls the groom aside and tells him, what are you doing? Most people leave the bad wine to the end. You've left the good wine. At that point, the groom has to have absolutely no idea what's going on. We have no idea if he knew that the wine was running out. In all likelihood, he had no idea. He was partying it up, and somebody else figured out, somebody like Mary figured out the wine was running out, and nobody told him, and they just fixed it. And so now he's just surprised. He's as surprised as anybody else. Because they don't know. The master didn't know. We're told, it seems that not even Mary necessarily. Mary's gone. Mary, the bride and groom, the master of the banquet, the other guests, none of them knew that Jesus had performed a miracle. The only people who definitely knew about it and saw it were the disciples and those servants, however many there were. So that's a fun story, right? It shows Jesus' miraculous powers in kind of a different way. There's not a whole lot of lighthearted miracles in the Bible. They're usually dealing with people being sick or things like that. He's at a wedding and he turns water into wine. But why is it Jesus' first miracle? Is it just an accident of history? Like that Jesus happened to be at a wedding with too little wine, and then Mary kind of forces him out of hiding by kind of making him use his powers to save the wedding? I feel like that's a bit too circumstantial. I don't think that that's a good enough answer. I think there has to be a reason that Jesus chose this as his first miracle. Changing water into wine. So in Mark chapter 2, early in Jesus' ministry as well, Mark and John have sort of variations on the story, so we don't know where these things took place in relation to each other. But in Mark chapter 2, Jesus is having a debate with the Pharisees, and they ask Jesus why his disciples don't fast like others and like the Pharisees do. Jesus responds by comparing his time on earth to a wedding banquet, just like the one they were at in Cana. And saying there will come a time when the bridegroom is taken away, and then they will fast. And then he immediately goes on to talk about old wine and new wine. And in Mark 2:22, Jesus says, "No one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." Now, the wedding at Cana does not mention wineskins. There probably were there, but they're not part of the story. We have these stone jars. But there's definitely an element of new wine in the story. A new way replacing an old way. A new idea replacing something older. And Jesus, I think, makes this even clearer by using those empty stone jars that would have been used for ritual cleansing. He's taking something old and making it new. He's replacing the old covenant with a new covenant. This old ritual purification with new ritual purification by wine. At the final supper with his disciples, moments before Jesus' hour is finally going to come, to use the language of John, when he's about to be crucified, Jesus raises a cup of wine, and he says this. This is from Luke. It says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." The stone jars represent the old covenant, and the water turned to wine represent the new covenant. And so, in this seemingly very simple miracle, Jesus is pointing forward to his hour, to his moment of triumph when he would die for our sins and then raise himself to life, establishing the new covenant of grace for all of us through his blood. But all of that was still to come in this moment. At the wedding in Cana, we know only that the disciples saw and they believed. Jesus' first revelation of glory was not flashy compared to healing people, raising people from the dead. But he showed his glory to his disciples, and he pointed towards what his ministry would be all about, preparing people for the truly amazing glory that would come on Easter. So tonight, I want to suggest that this week, take the time and bring your life before Jesus. Tell him the big stuff and the small stuff, because you never know how Jesus is going to show his glory. If he was able to use wine at a small town wedding to create this beautiful allegory of his whole ministry and the new covenant, then there's no limit what Jesus can use and what he can do. So be like Mary. Bring your problems to Jesus and leave them there, big or small, and see how he reveals his glory. And with that, let's spend some time in prayer with one another.